was basically just kind of one of their rituals that got enshrined in their history. Of course, he launched, 47 years ago to this day, and ended up doing one orbit in his Vostok spacecraft. What most people don't know is that how he re-entered wasn't what you would expect. He did not actually land with his space capsule because they didn't have the technology to do a soft landing of the capsule at that time. So what they actually had was this ejection seat, an incredibly advanced, almost like little mini spacecraft. And at about 25,000 feet, he would be ejected with retro rockets. He would fall another few thousand feet. Then if it was safe, he'd be separated from the seat. They would both land with parachutes. There were sensors for determining whether he landed in water, a little kind of survival pack, all sorts of things. But this ejection seat was an amazing piece of technology. I actually had an opportunity to go visit Russia a few years ago and visit a lot of the space kind of factories and stuff. And I met the designer that designed this retro rocket seat. And I asked him, this is an amazingly complex thing. It has so many points of failure. And he said, yeah, we built this tower that was the same height as the spacecraft to test this. And we would fire it, because this was also a launch abort system. In case the rocket blew up on launch, this little retro rocket could fire and take out the capsule just as well. And so they built a tower the same height and would test the seat this way. And I asked him how many tests they had to do, and he just laughed and said, well, by the end of the testing, by the time we finally got it right, there was a giant pile of these seats. And he said, in the landing zone. Now, there's a museum in Moscow, the Museum of Cosmonautics, which is a fascinating place. It's amazing because you go into it, and it's like a church. And it's very dark, a lot of colors. At the end of the very middle, where the pulpit would be, is a giant stained glass sculpture, with the sculpture of Yuri, almost in a Jesus figure. And it's interesting the way that became almost their religion, kind of the progress of those early eras. They've got a lot of cool stuff there. This is Velka and Strelka, the two first creatures that were returned safely from space, two dogs, and they're stuffed and preserved in the museum, and they look amazingly happy for being stuffed little dogs sitting there. But so this is a lot of the artifacts from the early Russian space history. One of the other interesting Russian space pioneers was Alexei Leonov, who I got the honor to meet. I had him stayed over at our house for a few days last year, and he was the first person to walk into space. He was also the commander of the first joint American-Russian space mission, the Apollo-Soyuz test project, and he was planned to be the first Russian on the moon in the Russian lunar program, which is a much riskier program than ours. He would have been the only person landing on the surface, doing everything by himself. When he went up on his first mission in Vostok 2, basically they added this thing to the side of it, which was an airlock. And it was interesting because the whole spacecraft is a sphere. They didn't have room for an airlock, so they designed an inflatable airlock, if you can imagine it. This thing would inflate once they got into space. He would crawl into it. They would evacuate the air from it, open the hatch, and he would go out. And they never done a spacewalk before. They had no idea what was going to happen. It was very risky. So he comes out of the airlock, normally, and as soon as he gets out into space, his whole spacesuit just kind of inflates like a balloon, like, and so he's kind of stuck like this for a while, thinking, oh darn. He's only got enough air for about 20 minutes, right? And so he has to somehow squeeze back into that little inflated cylinder. And the only way he could get back into the cylinder was to start letting the air out of his spacesuit. He had to lower it to dangerous levels just so he could bend his arms enough. And then he had to go in head first, where it was planned to go in feet first. And so basically this guy is wearing a balloon inside of another balloon, trying to turn around 180 degrees the whole time. And he's overheating. So they're like puddles of water inside of his spacesuit. But at any rate, somehow the guy managed to do this, get back in, return safely. On the way back, the service module for the Soyuz, for the Vostok, didn't separate, so they came in nose first. The hatch was heating up where the heat shield should have been. Just before it burned through the hatch, the service module broke off, spun around. The heat shield finally did take the heat, but because of that, it put them off trajectory. So they ended up landing deep in the Ural Mountains, and they couldn't find, the rescuers couldn't find it for 24 hours, and so they spent the night basically with wolves circling the space capsule, and basically made a little campfire and tried to fend the wolves off all night. And to this day, every Russian space mission, when they go up, actually brings guns and vodka with them for this reason. And so this is another kind of indication of how different this is than like the American NASA philosophy. But still, it's interesting we're exploring different directions here. Luckily, he got a nice spaceship named after him in the movie 2010, the Alexei Leonov. Another one of my favorite kind of stories from the Russian program is Soyuz 23, bringing these two fellows up to the space station. Now, the Russians had the first space station program was called Salyut, and they had 6 Salyut space stations that they put up in order, or so they told the world. It turned out that they were actually running 2 programs at the same time. They had the Salyut program, which was the civilian program, but they also had a top secret military space station program called the Almaz. And what they did is they called the Almaz Salyuts and they mixed them in. So, in fact, every other launch was really this Russian military space station. And the Almaz stations were very different. They were basically manned spy satellites. They had incredibly powerful cameras on them, and they would tell the cosmonauts every day kind of what to photograph as they were orbiting the Earth. Now, at the time, the Russians found out that we were working on this thing called the X-10 Dynastar, which was never actually completed. It was like an Air Force study. But they were convinced that this was an interceptor designed just to shoot down their military space stations. So they decided that they had to arm them. These stations actually had a 20-millimeter cannon that war-sighted along the station to fend off attacking spaceships. So in fact, this was the first fully armed and operational battle station in orbit. And when you think about this, you're firing this 20-millimeter cannon, and if you don't do anything else except fire the cannon, you're going to deorbit the station, right? So they had to fire the reaction control system, and the cosmonauts were terrified of ever firing the gun. So the only time they ever fired it was after the cosmonauts left once. They did a test firing and actually destroyed a satellite like 3 kilometers away from the space station. Anyway, they were supposed to dock with this thing. They came up to it. They had a lot of problems with the docking latch. It wouldn't dock properly, so they had to abort the mission. In fact, they never ended up on the space station. So they were coming back, and they got a little off course on landing. They hit this blizzard, actually, once their chutes opened on the Soyuz, which blew them way off course because the jet stream was going in a different direction than they were planning. They ended up falling down in Kazakhstan, right on top of Lake Tengiz, which at that time was frozen over in the middle of winter. Now, the capsule basically broke through the ice, sank into this lake, and this is the middle of the raging blizzard, right? And, of course, when they come to the atmosphere, little air valves open to let the air in because, they figure they're on dry land at that point. But at this point, water was pouring into the capsule. The cosmonauts were hanging upside down inside the thing inside their spacesuits. They had to pull out their knives, cut the straps off, cut their spacesuits off, grab rags, and start plugging the holes in their space capsule to keep it from flooding. Now, they sat at the bottom of this lake for 20 hours, and it was like 20 degrees below zero. And luckily, one of the cosmonauts was a submariner, and he was milking the carbon scrubber the whole night. As soon as he started to lose consciousness, he would turn on the carbon scrubber to clean out the air because he had very little battery power left. And basically, when they started getting clear-headed again, he would turn it back off to save battery power. Now, luckily, the next morning, the storm cleared. A helicopter pilot intrepidly saw the parachute sticking out of the ice, managed to snag it, and pull the whole thing out of the lake, bring it over to the shore. They unbolted it, of course, expecting the cosmonauts to be dead, and they both climbed out alive. And it's stories like that that kind of make you realize how courageous these guys were in the face of adversity, how, the history they had in their program was every bit as interesting as ours, and most of it's untold and unknown in the West. They did a lot of other things that we might have just heard a little bit about. They did the first planetary rover, the Lunokhod, in 1970. America did not launch a planetary rover until the Pathfinder Sojourner mission in 97, quite a bit later, 27 years later. To give you some sense, this is the size comparison between the two. The Lunokhod is the big one. Of course, technology advanced. Now, also, Lunokhod was on the moon, Pathfinder was on Mars, but they went approximately the same distance. Lunokhod traveled about 6 miles on the moon under remote control. They actually launched 2 of these. And in some sense, they become kind of the predecessors of the Spirit and Opportunity, which are just amazingly wonderful robots up on Mars right now. The Russians built a space shuttle, very much like ours, most people don't know about, called the Buran. In some sense, it had some advances. They couldn't build a reusable liquid fuel engine like the shuttle, so they put all the main boosters on their disposable external rocket, which gave it 50% more cargo capacity. It flew once, unmanned, until they automated takeoff and landing. And after that, the balloon collapsed, and they lost funding, and they basically scrapped the whole program. What was almost impressive as the brand was the airplane they built to carry it, the Antonov AN-225. This is the largest airplane ever flown. The tail of this airplane is larger than the wingspan of a 737. And they flew it many, many times.